Hello, I'm Jennifer Feltman. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Today I'm going to be talking about the fragments of the Gothic choir screen of the Cathedral of Chartres. These have been dispersed in collections throughout the United States. Before I begin the talk, first I'd like to thank Dominique Lallemant for inviting me to present a lecture for the American Friends of Chartres during the celebration of 1,000 years of the cathedral. The Cathedral of Chartres is very important to me. It was the first Gothic monument I studied in graduate school. All the way back in fall of 2003, I was in a seminar led by Professor Paula Gerson and was given the task of leading a section where I would have to give an overview of all of the sculptural programs of the cathedral. That was no small task, but it has led to my now more than 20-year love of the sculptures of Chartres and the cathedral itself. However, there was one sculptural program that was missing from my presentation that day. That is the sculptures of the Jubé or choir screen. Of course, these were in scholarship, but at that time it was not very easy to find good images of them. The main text is the work that was the thesis of Jean Maillon, published as a book in 1964. However, its black and white images pale in comparison to seeing the original sculptures. Further, unless anyone knew who to ask, it was challenging to see the original sculptures themselves. They had been displayed in the chapel Saint-Piat at the eastern end of the cathedral, but that chapel closed in 1995, and they've only recently again been put on public display. For the past few years, the fragments have been undergoing cleaning and conservation under the direction of the Drac Val de Loire, the regional Ministry of Culture in charge of them. I would like to thank Irène Chautuil of the Drac for kindly allowing me to view the fragments of the Jubé as they were undergoing restoration in 2023. At that time, I also had the privilege of meeting the restorers and was able to see the care that has been taken to conserve these fragments. This work has made the beautiful polychromy which once enlivened the figures even more apparent. The work of the restorers has also involved demounting any cast heads that had been added later. The viewer now only sees the authentic stones without any prosthetic replacements. If indeed a head has been remounted, it is of authentic stone from the original monument. In this detail of the Virgin from the Nativity, we clearly see the remnants of polychromy on the Virgin's eyes, lips, and cheeks. These have been studied further by the French National Monuments Laboratory, the LMRH, located just outside of Paris. Their reports document the many layers of paint that were used to cover these beautiful sculptures. They explain further the mineral pigments and binders that are used. At the same time that the fragments were being cleaned and studied, the chapel Saint-Piat was being renovated, and it opened again to the public in 2024. It houses the fragments of the choir screen that have remained in the cathedral's possession. It really is a fabulous space which you must visit the next time you go to Chartres, and here you see a view of it with some of the newly designed contemporary stained glass windows in the interior. The large fragments from the Chartres choir screen are installed en face, that is, just at face level, beneath the windows on both sides of the chapel. This vantage does not attempt to recreate the original experience of the Jubé with the sculptures placed high above the viewer. However, it does allow for an appreciation of the sculpture as it would have been seen from the vantage of the imagiers, the carvers, or the masons who carved them. In this presentation, I will be discussing fragments of the Gothic choir screen of Chartres that are dispersed in the United States. My talk will provide a history of the rediscovery of fragments beneath the floor of the cathedral and the methods that scholars have used over the years to put several of these pieces back together again. There are many figures who play a role. I'll focus particularly on French art historian Léon Précieux, and also I'll mention American art historians Brooks Stoddard and Chuck Little. I conclude by discussing and demonstrating a new technique that I've been using with my team for reconstructing fragments of Gothic sculpture using digital modeling. Our goal with this new method is both to precisely document sculptures so that we have a long time preservation of the knowledge of the morphology of the sculptures, and also to use such models to help us find the original location within the overall design of any sculptural program, including that of the Chartres choir screen. This has, of course, been of interest to scholars over the years, but there are certain advantages of using digital techniques over physical reconstruction, as was used in the past with, for example, the moulage or plaster casts that began to be used in the 19th century. First, before we'll discuss any of this, I want to take a step back a bit from the fragments and just define what a choir screen is and see how the choir screen originally functioned within the Cathedral of Chartres. Here, we're looking at the cathedral from the vantage of the south transept. If one approaches the Cathedral of Chartres as pilgrims likely did in the 13th century, these would have been the portals used as your primary entrance. These are the portals which have porches extending out from them. The sculptural programs focus in the center on the Last Judgment, and this idea of the judgment is further enhanced by flanking portals of the martyrs to the left and confessors to the right. We can imagine a traveler entering the cathedral through the central portal as we see it here, with the doorway opened. Although they were walking beneath an image of the Last Judgment, which depicted damnation on one side and blessing on the other side, here the figure of Christ on the trumeau holds his fingers up in a blessing, making definite that blessing was available if one would enter through the door that is Christ. Here in the distance, the stained glass of the north transept and rose lances seem to hover in the foreground. When one enters the south transept today, a large enclosure, which you can see outlined in blue on the floor plan, is still in place. The choir screen of Chartres, which you see here in orange, would have originally been installed between the two easternmost piers of the crossing. This installation with a photographic image of the Jubei was put in place during a restoration. It allows us to imagine the location of the original Jubei. It also recreates a possibility of how it could have been constructed, but of course the elevated staircase that you see here would not have originally been there. The purpose of the monumental architectural furnishing of a Jubei was liturgical. The screen, in effect, serves as a boundary between the nave and the choir. Traditionally, this has been understood to mark the boundary between the space of the laity in the nave and the space of the sacred space, that is, of the choir, which was reserved for the high altar and the clergy who were involved in the liturgy, specifically the liturgy of the Mass. So we see here where the arrow is indicating this would be the Jubei or choir screen put in place. Jacqueline Young's year 2000 Art Bulletin article, Beyond the Barrier, the Unifying Role of the Gothic Choir Screen, and her subsequent book, The Gothic Screen, has nuanced this interpretation of the choir screen as barrier. Young shows how the screen plays an important function in framing the performance of the liturgy, helping to stage the whole with visual art that translates the subject matter of the liturgy itself, and in effect translates between clerical and lay spaces. We see here another reconstruction view which shows the original state that Jean Maillon thought the choir screen was positioned in. You can see here we have a continuous Gothic arcade that was populated with sculptural panels. These would have been large limestone panels that depict scenes of the infancy and nativity of Christ. They hearken to the imagery of the west facade on the portal of the Incarnation as one finds it on the 12th century royal portals. So there seems to be some dialogue and subject matter between what's on the exterior of the cathedral and what's on the interior. The choir screen also served as a platform, a quite literal platform, from which clergy could intone the Mass or preach. If you look at the bottom of the diagram, you'll see that a staircase was involved in this that allowed the preacher or the clergy to ascend to the top of the jubé and effectively walk across it. The best document we have of the original state of the cathedral is this engraving by Nicolas de l'Armesson from 1697. Here we see a large cross surmounts the center of the jubé. Jubés often have crucifixion imagery connected to them, in particular because they are also about the Mass and communicating that information. The choir screens, at the time that by the time we get to the 18th century, choir screens are largely out of fashion in the Catholic Church. And this is not only for religious reasons, but also for aesthetic ones. But if one reads carefully the text about what the clergy wanted in the 18th century, they first point out there were very practical issues. One of those is that this is a nearly 300-year-old structure by the time you get to the 18th century, and it's in need, and they say dire need, of repair. But added to this, the clergy at this point in time simply didn't care for the Gothic style of decor. The style of decor that was popular at that moment was neoclassical. So, in April of 1763, the Bishop of Chartres approved the canon's project to demolish the fragile Gothic screen and to replace it with a new screen that had been proposed by the canons. It was replaced by an iron and copper gate. This had gilding as well, and this was framed with neoclassical sculptures, or structures that also had sculptures. It is this jubé that is demolished in 1866 under Viollet-le-Duc, and a portion of this, the gate, was installed and is still in this position on the first floor of the south tower at the cathedral. So if you enter through the western facade doors and look to the right to the south tower, you will see a portion of this structure is still in the building, but in this new location. What happened to the sculptures of the Gothic choir screen? During the demolition, narrative scenes from the Nativity of Christ were fragmented and some of the figures were decapitated. Because these sculptures were important to the church, even though the style was out of fashion, they did maintain them in the church. And so what they did was to take large fragments, turn them upside down, and use them as pavement inside of the cathedral. It also seems that, again, some figures were decapitated, and the heads find their use in other locations. I'll speak more about some of the heads that were later on the art market, but essentially we know that those heads were reused in houses within the house walls, exterior walls within the city of Chartres. These sculptures were essentially lost to memory, but then in the 19th century, a fire broke out at the Cathedral of Chartres, which we're seeing a painting of this from 1836 by François Pernot. This fire did much like what happened recently at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, destroyed the entire charpente of the roof, caused the roof itself to collapse, and actually caused much damage within the cathedral and required rebuilding. Excavations were done at this time, or they were done a bit later for the reconstruction by Lassus, and then later Viollet-le-Duc continues those excavations. It was in 1837, or between 1837 and 1848, that many large fragments of the Gothic jubé of Chartres were discovered as being used as pavement in the floor inside of the cathedral. These, again, focus on the nativity and early life of Christ. So I'm going to show you a series of these, what remains, that has been cleaned and is on display in the Chapel Saint-Piat. Here we see a scene of the Annunciation. To your right as a viewer is the angel Gabriel, who is announcing to the Virgin Mary to the left that she'll bear the Christ child. We'll notice missing heads and even a gaping hole in the center. These two figures are figures of the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth. They represent the scene of the Visitation. We also have scenes of the shepherds who come at the moment of the Nativity to watch, and the shepherd is leading here, watching. Interestingly, here we have really beautiful depictions of the figure's hands, and all of these sculptures were in fact carved with the recognition that a viewer would stand beneath and look above. So you have to, if you do visit these in the gallery, I think it's useful to crouch a bit low and look high and imagine seeing them from that vantage, which replicates a bit more of the way they would have been intended to be seen. So here, a photograph that shows the nativity, the moment of the nativity, taken from the choir screen. This is not taken from below, but from en face, and so you do lose some of the sense of that. But this particular figure is quite interesting also because we do have a figure whose head is intact, and actually two here, the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. And this is important to give us a sense of the overall figures and the overall design. I'll return to the figure on the right, Joseph, who is missing his head towards the end of this talk. If you'll notice, just looking at this same panel from a different vantage, we have a figure of the donkey who is eating hay out of the manger here. And in essence, the carvers have created a scene that also connects to the West Facade imagery. So if you think back to the royal portals of the West Facade, as you enter through the Incarnation doorway, the imagery beneath is a figure of Christ on an altar, as if he's already become the bread. And here, very much the manger presented to us is very mensa or altar-like. Further, the carving of the figures rounds around, and this does indicate the position perhaps of where it would have been located on the jubé, that this would have been a piece meant to be seen both from the front and from the side. If we look further at the image of the Virgin, she's delicately and tenderly reaching down and sleeping very much in a naturalistic way one would expect a mother and child to be, resting with the child nearby. And in her left hand, she reaches and pulls a bit of the cloth away from the face of the child. And in essence, it's almost as if she's blessing, but this is with her left hand. With her right hand, she grasps the clothing around her face. Throughout all of these, there's such a rich focus on cloth and touch. It's absolutely beautiful. Okay, and now we see the panel of the Magi before Herod. The Magi, of course, being the wise men who visit eventually Christ at the Nativity, And here they're depicted as the three figures, headless on the left. Herod is shown seated with his legs crossed, as sometimes we see untrustworthy rulers with crossed legs. The Dream of the Magi is also represented on the choir screen, and another view here of an intact head. Perhaps this one is preserved because it's not entirely, or it's attached in part to the background. It's not fully in the round. And yet another panel depicting the adoration of the Magi, with the Virgin and Child on the right-hand side. I'll note here that this is one example where we have a head that was dismembered but has been reattached to the sculptures, and this is in fact an original head. This is the head of the Magi Gaspar. It has been cleaned, and we really gain a sense of the figural type here. I'll look more closely at the style in just a moment, but I will point out that many on this particular panel have this curious smile and the almond-shaped eyes. Yet another style of sculpture has much more round, soft cheeks. This is the presentation in the temple. Returning to the adoration of the Magi choir screen, we find here that there are fragments, of course, heads that are missing, and I'll point out a fragment that resides in a collection in the United States that was discovered in the 1970s as belonging to the Jubei of Notre Dame de Chartres. And this is, of course, the head of the Virgin that you see on the right. This is in the collection of the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University. This collection is known as the Brummer Collection. There are other heads we'll look at. There are more than I'll have time to speak about today, but I'll point out an additional head at Bowdoin College, and also one in a private collection. So the Virgin figure that you see here, this was purchased by Joseph Brummer in the year 1923 from an art dealer whose name is Altunian in the city of Macon. It had previously been installed in the wall of a house, according to Altunian, and this is essentially what the record in the Brummer files records. The Brummers, I'll give you a little bit of a background on them. The Brummers are art dealers who are working essentially from around 1906 or so. They establish galleries in Paris. The first of these is established by Joseph Brummer, and eventually his brother Imre and Ernest Brummer join him. Their gallery in Paris is together for a moment, but in 1914, Joseph flees Paris for the United States, essentially because of World War I. He is Jewish. He had formerly left from Austro-Hungary with his brothers, also because of conflict. And so he leaves in 1914 and establishes a gallery in New York. Eventually, they also continue the art trade in between the time. So at the time this head was purchased from Altunian, Joseph Brummer is in the United States, and he's working between France or Europe and the United States, mostly between New York and France. He makes annual voyages in the summer, transatlantic trips, during which you'll have meetings with various antiquarians and scout out new purchases. So this is one of the objects that remained in Joseph Brummer's collection, and he died in 1947, Many of these objects were auctioned off in the Park Burnett auction in 1949. Some of them were not auctioned, and they end up in the collection or in the storage houses that Ernest Brummer will eventually have in New York. Ernest Brummer himself leaves France in 1940 to join his brothers in New York, and he planned to return to Paris, but World War II stopped him from doing so, and so he ultimately will stay in the United States, Ernest Brummer, until he dies in 1964. In 1966, the widow of Ernest Brummer, Ella Bachet Brummer, is searching for a place for these last remaining objects, and particularly in the case of this object, she was dealing with a collection of mostly medieval objects, and she wanted to ensure that this would become part of a collection that would be studied by students. And some of these objects were, again, objects that did not sell in the Park Burnett auction, and for whatever reason they didn't sell beyond that. And so they end up in this collection of about 250 objects that are sold in a partial sale and gift to Duke University in 1966. This sale forms the core of what will become the National Museum of Art. At the time, it was called the Duke University Museum of Art. And the head that you're seeing here, the head of the Virgin, was a part of this vast amount of material. So early on in the 1970s, so if these come into the collection in 1966, it takes some time to work through relatively unprovenanced works. The art historian, Léon Précieux from France, is researching this collection, and he gets images of this head. He's corresponding with then museum director, and he's really interested in this particular head because when he sees the image, he knows of also the Jubei of Chartres and immediately thinks about the style of the figures. And so he writes to the director that he would like to have a plaster cast made of the Duke head, if that was even possible. And they work this all out. They make a plaster cast. They ship the plaster cast to France so that Léon Précieux can test the connection of this head, which he believes belongs to the Virgin. And lo and behold, it fits. There's a gap of stone missing, and you can see here the image on the screen is an image on the left of the Le Figaro article announcing this discovery of the head of the Virgin of Chartres found in the United States, and on the right, the current restoratrice holding up the actual moulage that was made for Léon Précieux at Duke and sent to France. That was for a very long time connected with the sculpture. She's holding it in place here to show that it does indeed connect, and the way you can really see that is if you look at the headdress of the Virgin, her veil. There is a direct link between those pieces. This is even further clear if we look more closely at the sculptures, in particular the style. And you see the curious style of the faces here with the very interesting smiles and arched brows and almond-shaped eyes. These are by the hand of the same sculptor. Another head resides in the collection of Bowdoin College, and it is a limestone head of a king, which we see here. This was also tested by moulage for its connection to another torso. This torso is shown here in the image. Again, at the time it was kept in the crypt in the chapel of Saint Martin. And it's another place where we find this moulage being used, a connection, but also a gap of stone between the two. Here we see them all together. This was a gift to Bowdoin in 1926. and here a head of the king Herod from a private collection. So it was thought that this connected to the sculpture, and here we see the moulage put in place. And what is really amazing to see when we have the head of Herod placed on his body, all of a sudden his psychology, the whole figure's sense of movement, and really just the psychology of Herod, who is plotting something really terrible, is visible to us. And that's something I think we lose when the figures, of course, don't have their heads. Another head, which surfaced a bit later, is also one that has been connected to the Jubei of Chartres. This is a limestone head that has been connected with the figure of Joseph. It's today housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was purchased in 2007. Here we see art historian Chuck Little holding a copy of that head, and he was the person who first made the connection between this object and the Jubei. And you can see it also bears some of those same striking similarities in figural style, or at least in the sculptural style of the eyes and physiognomy of the face. So one of the keys for searching for its connection is looking at this particular panel very closely at the place where the head of Joseph was severed. If we get a little bit closer to both, we can see that there does seem to be a similarity between the geometry of the shapes, and essentially this kind of work is a bit like puzzle solving, putting together puzzles, but the problem is often there are missing pieces between the puzzles, so you have to intuit the connection from the overall size, from the outlines, and look for at least places where there are matches between stone. So here a photo montage of the head combined, and we get a greater sense of really the tenderness of this scene. Not only do we have the Virgin Mary who is tenderly caring for her child, but we also have Joseph, who's a key figure in this story, holding a cloth again, even with a backdrop of a cloth behind them. And this, of course, would all have been enhanced with polychromy. So here I'm showing you again this head, which we have connected, and it was once a part of the Brummer Galleries and their work in purveying medieval art. So together, the Brummer Galleries in Paris and New York were responsible for purveying ancient African and medieval art throughout the world. So it was not entirely medieval, but it is actually through this gallery that many prominent collections of medieval sculpture in the United States, including core works in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Boston MFA, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and Jean-Paul Getty Museums have their collection. And then, of course, what we've already discussed, the Nasher Museum, formerly the Duke University Museum of Art. In 2023, I was conducting work for the Chantier Scientifique de Notre Dame, studying other material, but while I was at the Nasher Museum, I also had the opportunity to work with my colleague. We were documenting in 3D fragments of sculpture, and we knew, of course, that the Nasher had this head from the Chartres Jubei, and we thought this would be a really unique moment to make a document of that head and to have a really good digital model. Essentially, the digital models that we're making are the current day version of a moulage. They also have many more advantages than the moulage in terms of the way that they can be used in virtual space, the way they can be shared, and the way they can be surrogates for the original objects. So I want to thank Kate Werwe, curator at the National Museum and Brian Hilley, who were hands-on helping us all the way. Here you see an image of my colleague Alex Tokovenine. He works with me at the University of Alabama. He's a professor of anthropology, primarily studying Mayan material, but he's also an expert in digital documentation, and so we've collaborated quite a bit. He's in the process of scanning here, and I'll take you through that process just to give you a little bit of detail. We did a twofold process, or at least two types of digital models. The first was structured light scanning, and so that's the image you see on the screen here, and that's the image that you saw of Alex. He was doing the structured light scanning. That model gives us a 0.2 millimeter resolution and 0.04 millimeters accuracy, which is a very good accuracy for getting the measurements of the original object. It also, or it's best for this precise measurement. It doesn't capture the texture quite as well as photogrammetry, so we also did a process called photogrammetry. What photogrammetry is, it's a photographic technique. It uses a mirrorless digital camera. We tend to use Sony AR7 cameras, and we tend to use 50 millimeter lenses on those cameras. We try to have an overall even lighting for the object, and the process of photogrammetry requires that you take a series of overlapping images. They overlap about 60%, and these images are taken essentially in a globe around an object. What you're seeing on the screen is the computer program Agisoft Metashape, which is a software that is used to mesh together the photographs taken during a photogrammetry field work. And so each little small image is actually an individual two-dimensional photo. In the software, you're able to align 3 points in XYZ space on several of the objects, and this alignment process and the computer's algorithms are able to run to connect together and essentially stitch together the images to create a point cloud model. And that point cloud model can then be used to generate a mesh model. And we take those models and we have them preserved for long term. We can use the file types of OBJ or PLY. We can use these to print a resin moulage if one needed a head to do a test. But what's even more interesting is that the three-dimensional models could also be used to test connections with other broken fragments, or to even project those onto a fragment itself. So I'll show you here yet one more use. This is not the full resolution of the model, but it is a resolution of it in the program called Sketchfab. Sketchfab is essentially a 3D model viewer. It allows one to view the model in as many dimensions as we decide to set up when we put it together. And what's really useful about this from an archaeological and art historical point of view is that it allows someone who's studying things like the fractures of the object, or even looking here at, we can see fossils in the stone, just to get an overall view. This kind of manipulation of an original heritage work would not really be feasible over long terms. One wants to be very careful with such fragile material. However, once an object is digitized and put into this platform, it can be viewed by researchers and essentially used for research. It can also be viewed by the general public who may be just interested in this material. So this really represents where my work lies today in documenting, and we hope to continue some of this, but at the moment this is the fragment that we have digitized for the project. It is actually housed, if you would like to see the image, it's housed at NotreDameInColor.org. There is a tab on that project that shows our documentation, and you can go to the Alabama Digital Humanities Center project for Notre Dame in Color, and you'll see other sculpted heads that are a part of it. So thank you so very much for your time. And I thank again the American Friends of the Cathedral of Chartres for the opportunity to present this talk. I hope it was enriching. And if you'd like to be in touch, you can find me on the University of Alabama's website.